I would encourage every single member of this committee to talk to lieutenants and captains and majors and colonels and sergeants and staff sergeants and sergeants major and specialists who are doing the job right now on the front lines or across the country, and they have seen a sea change in the environment and the morale and the spirit in their formations.
Hey again, everybody. It is 5 o'clock in New York, 2 o'clock in Los Angeles. I'm Jacob Soboroff in for Nicole Wallace. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth can tout his leadership all he wants. But according to new reporting from MS Now, the sea change those actually inside the ranks of the military are experiencing is not a positive one. This is a quote. Nearly 6 months into the United States war with Iran and a year into the Pentagon's decision to launch deadly strikes to kill alleged drug traffickers, the number of service members seeking a formal discharge from the military as conscientious objectors has skyrocketed, according to two groups that helped them file their applications. MS Now spoke to 5 troops who want out of the military because what they saw in recent months challenged their moral beliefs. The reasons they cited included being ordered to violate international law, seeing the civilian death toll as a result of American military interventions surge, and their concerns over extended deployments with no clear mission or strategy. The Defense Department did not reply to requests for comment, but those accounts add to the picture of what the New York Times reports as an army that has been left, quote, essentially rudderless, thanks to Pete Hegseth. From that Times report, it says this. The Army has not had a chief of staff, the service's top officer, since Mr. Hegseth fired General Randy George without explanation in April. And there are no signs that he is close to filling the position, said current and former officials speaking anonymously. Mr. Hegseth has forced out at least 3 senior officers who had been viewed as potential successors to General George. The turmoil comes as the Army, the military's largest service, faces its busiest period since the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Army air defense soldiers are playing the leading role in defending U.S. troops in the Middle East from increasingly sophisticated Iranian missile attacks. The Army's command in Europe is providing critical intelligence and other support to Ukraine as it fights to hold off a larger Russian force. And that is where we begin this hour with MS Now Pentagon reporter Priya Sridhar, who broke the story on those service members raising the flag that they are being asked to violate international law. Also with us, military analyst, retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. And Paul Rieckhoff is here as well. He is the host of the Independent Americans podcast and the founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America. Priya, this reporting is amazing. Tell us about the 5 service members that you spoke with and why they want out of the military.
Yeah, Jacob, this was so interesting, especially because Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth continuously tries to boast about his record number of recruits joining the military. Well, it looks like we're seeing a record number of service members trying to get out of the military as conscientious objectors. And as you mentioned, I spoke to 5 of them. One of the service members who was deployed to Operation Epic Fury, which, of course, is the war on Iran, told me that they believed that they were being ordered to target and bomb civilian infrastructure, which is, of course, a violation of international humanitarian law, according to the Geneva Accords. And when this service member tried to raise those concerns with their chain of command, they were repeatedly told that these were dual-use pieces of infrastructure like bridges, which means they were used for both civilian purposes and military purposes. I also, by the way, Jacob, spoke to 2 service members who were deployed in support of Operation Southern Spear, which, as you remember, were those 60 boat strikes that occurred over the last year that killed about 210 people. Those boats were allegedly carrying narco-terrorists and drugs into the United States. And those 2 service members told me that they also believe that there wasn't enough justification or intelligence that the people on those boats were, in fact, narco-terrorists. And they were very concerned that they were potentially killing innocent civilians and perhaps fishermen. So the violation of international law, the surging of civilian death tolls, including that girls' school in Minab, Iran, where we know that 150 schoolgirls were killed, and just this overall feeling, as you mentioned, Jacob, which you and I have talked a lot about this, like those service members on the USS Abraham Lincoln who were seeing their deployments extended, no clear end goal in sight, no strategy. They echo those sentiments as well.
General Hertling, I wanted to this conversation makes me think of a conversation that I actually had with a friend of mine who's a Navy veteran and said that this person served in Operation Enduring Freedom, and this person and their colleagues believed in the mission that they were sent to carry out. And I think it's pretty simple. Those folks in the military want to feel like they're fighting for a reason, and it's a reason that they believe in, and they do not want to be told to break international law. Is that an oversimplification of what we're hearing in Priya's reporting there?
No, Jacob, not at all. That is spot on. And what I'll tell you is, reading Priya's piece and also the piece in the New York Times, there is so much under the wave tops on both of those articles, those great reportings by both of the people that did them. I'll do an anecdotal piece of evidence. During my 38 years serving in uniform, I had 2 individuals who submitted conscientious objector packets. They are very difficult to work through. These individuals have to talk to chaplains and lawyers and commanders and their chain of command. They have to provide proof in terms of letters. It is a difficult process to go through. So when you're talking about the uptick, as Priya reported, from 50 a year to 140 just since since the latest operation started, both in South America and also in Iran, it is gobsmacking to me. The other piece in the New York Times talks about the implications of moral injury, not only on the frontline troops, but even the ones that pull the trigger on long-range weapon systems, Patriot defense systems, the overworking of the air defenders. There is so much in those 2 articles that any military person could break down for you that is truthfully giving a very good state of our American military today. And there are concerns. I have concerns. I've talked to a lot of young officers, some NCOs, and a few senior officers, and they are all expressing the same things. And it goes back to one specific thing: a lack of communication between soldiers and their leaders, sailors and their leaders, the government and the citizens, and the government, the military, and the Congress. Those are the things that Clausewitz, an 18th century theoretician, said are required whenever you go to war: the support of the people, the leadership of the government, and the passion of the military. We're failing in all 3 of those areas right now in the conflicts we're executing.
And it's no wonder that the reporting that Priya has done over the course of the last several weeks about the mental health crises of the sailors and the airmen aboard the Lincoln has become part of the conversation around this. Paul, I want to read another interesting part of Priya's reporting about a person who runs a hotline help service to help members file as conscientious objectors. He said that unlike other times in American history when conscientious objectors were typically junior enlisted service members, many of his clients today have been in the military for more than a decade. They represent all enlisted and officer ranks up to major, and many have even attended service academies prior to their commissions. They've cited Operation Epic Fury and the attacks against drug traffickers in the southern sphere and the bombing of the Minab school in Iran in February as reasons for having a profound change in thought toward war. Well, your thoughts?
You know, I challenge maybe one central part of the piece when they say that the military is rudderless. It's actually not rudderless. There is a rudder, and it's the acting Secretary of Culture War, Pete Hegseth, who is driving that rudder through the military at whatever cost is necessary to execute what he and Trump want to execute in changing the military and eventually our entire culture. I've always said that Hegseth is the tip of the spear for the change they want in America and for the world. And you're seeing it at the military. And our troops have a conscience. They have character. They have ethics. And if you are black or a woman, or you don't like being on ships for 9 months, or you're against illegal wars, or you're against blowing people up for no reason, there's a lot of reasons to be uncomfortable and unhappy with this military and this leadership. But it starts at the top. And it starts with Hegseth, who has a total disregard for some of the most basic foundations of our military, to include the constant melding of our politics and our military. He's out stumping in Iowa for partisan political candidates while, our troops are suffering on the USS Lincoln. So this is a strategy. It's not accidental. And I think Hegseth is on strategy. And imagine how much further he would be if he wasn't screwing up all the time. I mean, he's on plan. Yeah, exactly. He's doing exactly what Trump hired him to do, and what many of us warned he might do if he was confirmed.
Let's go over the legal aspects of this case. Lisa, starting with you. Well, let's talk about Judge Talwani's order today, reversing her earlier injunction. As you noted, that was the sole block that remained against the president's implementation of his election-themed executive order. And in particular, what remained of that was a block on the section of the executive order that directed the United States Postal Service to effectively take control over the transmission of mail-in ballots. The U.S. Postal Service in recent days, Katie, has not only proposed a regulation, but finalized a regulation over that, how that is supposed to work. And now today, with Judge Talwani's decision lifting her injunction, that frees the administration up to start implementing the executive order and allows the United States Postal Service to implement its rule. However, we are now hearing in a lawsuit filed by states this morning to block the implementation of that rule that not only are states themselves not necessarily prepared to grapple with this, but they have real concerns about whether the USPS is technologically capable of implementing what it proposes to do to mail-in ballots. And let me just lay out for you and our viewers what it is that is supposed to happen. The United States Postal Service wants a list from states of everyone who is authorized to vote by mail or through absentee ballot. Those are what they call enrolled voters. And unless and until a voter is enrolled, the United States Postal Service says in this regulation, they will not transmit that person's ballot. Now, state election officials have submitted a variety of declarations where they say not only would this be really problematic for them, but this is going to be hugely problematic for the United States Postal Service itself. Why? Because the ballot portal, the internet site through which this is all supposed to happen, that's not even up yet. And USPS hasn't told states when it will be up, nor have they clarified to them what happens when they run into problems. And the list goes on and on about sort of the technological infeasibility of doing this, even as the administration takes steps to tell everybody this is in the name of election integrity and ballot security.
I have so much to go from there, and I'm so happy you laid it out that way. There are a lot of problems that are easy to foresee as you've just started laying out. Let's go back to just to get into more detail what exactly Donald Trump's executive order was demanding. When she's talking about enrolled voters, who are these, in the Trump administration's view, enrolled voters supposed to be?
So under the Trump administration's view, they want the Department of Homeland Security to compile lists, match those lists against state databases of their enrolled voters, and then be able to compare those lists. The problem, as we've discussed on prior occasions, Katie, is that when you compare databases, and this is true not just in elections, but in all sorts of databases. Databases are bad at matching because they are computerized algorithms that look for exact matches, and that therefore come up with all sorts of false positives. In this instance, false positives meaning possible non-citizens, when in fact it's just a maiden name, it's just a typo, it's just a nickname, it's just a hyphen, it's just all sorts of a transposed. The thing to recognize here, and I want to piggyback on something that Lisa just said, every challenge up until today, including both of the challenges before Judge Talwani, was filed prior to the rule even existing. So the rule was only released on Friday. Now we can get to the merits.
So this is part of what the Supreme Court, and I love having both of you on. James, you send these amazing notes ahead of your appearances, and they're really good at teaching a layman like me the fundamentals of law and the details around these rulings. One of them is about not just standing, but about, what was the term? Ripeness. Ripeness. Not, is your avocado ripe enough, but is this lawsuit ripe? As in, is it timely? Has it been filed at a date where the order in this case was already in effect? You can't just file something ahead of time saying, we believe this is going to happen and we want to stop you from going forward with it. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And here's something that wasn't in the notes, Katie, but I'll say this. The reason, and the word chicanery, litigation chicanery, was not in the notes. That phrase was not in the notes. But that is exactly what the Trump administration has engaged in here. And Ketanji Brown Jackson noted it. And today, Judge Talwani, despite ruling for the Trump administration, essentially called the administration out. So ripeness means you're suing too soon. The state sued too soon. Well, now now the Trump administration is going to turn right around and say, well, now it's too late because we're too close to the election. Yeah. This is the goal Goldilocks problem.
Judge Jackson called it a Kafkaesque nightmare. Yes. Lisa, you mentioned that the states had already filed this morning. We just got this from Governor Josh Shapiro. He says, I'm suing the Trump administration to stop their unconstitutional attempt to change the rules and restrict mail-in voting. I'll remind the president of my track record going up against him in court and winning to protect Pennsylvania's free, fair, safe, and secure elections. Was Pennsylvania already a part of this lawsuit?
Yes, it was, but not in the capacity that we traditionally think about. So most of the states that have sued here have Democratic attorneys general. They sue in the name of their state. Josh Shapiro is a plaintiff here in his official capacity of governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because his attorney general declined to join this lawsuit. He has done this before in lawsuits against the Trump administration, but he is part and parcel of the lawsuit I was describing.
Let's talk, Vaughn, a little bit more about the inability for the federal government to prove, so far at least, that they have a handle on who is legally allowed to vote and who is not. You've been reporting on stuff that's been happening in Nevada.
Exactly. It's the fact is that there are 4 states already that the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security have gone to states to allege that there were 250,000 non-citizens who were registered to vote in Nevada, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and California. And with our colleague Laura Barone Lopez, we're posting a new story in which it's not just officials in Nevada, but it's officials in California, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania that also tell us that the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, is already ferociously walking back its claims, not being able to provide proof that there was actually that number, 250,000 non-citizen voters registered, and that they've been asking for the data and for the records from the federal government to be provided to them so that they can cross-check with their own state records. And the Department of Homeland Security, despite first making this claim the day that Donald Trump delivered that primetime address, 1 month later, still has not provided those 4 states with the information. And so this is what hits at the heart of all of this here, is the fact that the federal government is the one that is demanding states turn over their voter rolls to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, and to the Department of Homeland Security, to the U.S. Postal Service, as a means of not only restricting who gets ballots here in this midterm election, but even perhaps more importantly, if you look towards 2027, Katie, this is part of the concern that we are hearing from elections officials and from election experts here, is that for the better part of the last year and a half, the Trump administration has tried to prove that non-citizens are committing mass amounts of voter fraud. And that is why Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and that he actually won the 2024 election by even greater amounts of numbers. So what are they doing? Effectively forcing the states to turn over their voter rolls to the U.S. Postal Service, and then after the midterm elections, go and attempt to prosecute potentially state elections officials for allowing non-citizen ineligible voters to get ballots in this election process. And so, you know, it could be, right, in the words of one election expert to me, it could be very well accidental in minimal number of people that actually received a ballot that were non-citizen voters or ineligible. But that doesn't mean that Donald Trump and the Trump administration are not going to try to extrapolate those few examples to ultimately try to seek and prosecute state elections officials for allowing them to get ballots.
So if state elections officials get prosecuted or are worried about getting prosecuted, what is the fear here? That they start looking at people and saying, I don't think you're eligible to vote, and take away their ability to vote?
That would certainly be a fear. I mean, if you are a state elections official and you are doing the very best you can, you are in a state with millions of voters, and you are supposed to be able to determine there's just no this, and this goes to the point that you were referencing, whether or not any of this is practicable in advance of the 2026 election. To Vaughn's point, a lot of this, I think, is aimed at 2028. But let's be clear that the fact that this is being done now is not an accident. It is intentionally been delayed. The government has never at any point in this litigation, Katie, defended the rule on the merits.
Well, they're going to have to at some point.
They will have to now.
Lisa, briefly?
One of the things I think that is important to convey to people is that there are sort of two efforts going on here. One is to limit who is eligible to vote, this compilation of the state citizenship list by DHS that Vaughn is talking about. But separately, there is an effort by the U.S. Postal Service to say to states, of those people in your state who are registered to vote, you have to pre-clear with us those among them who are authorized to vote by mail. And in some states, that's less than everyone. There are sort of two parallel tracks to limit who is eligible to vote in this election, but also to set up the narrative in advance of the election that if the Republicans lose big, Donald Trump will say, we tried to prevent this. We were unable to do so because non-citizens voted and people voted by mail and cheated by doing it.
We want to bring in MS Now Pentagon reporter Priya Sridhar and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. General Clark, I appreciate your being with us. Priya, to you, you've been reporting on the conditions for these service members for a bit now. You had a chance to speak to 5 of these troops who've expressed these objections to the way this war is being carried out. What is the objection? What are they detailing to you in these conversations?
Yeah, I think this is so interesting, Peter, especially because Defense Secretary Hegseth has tried to boast about the number of recruits coming into the military. But now we're seeing at least one of these groups saying that they're processing 150 conscientious objector applications. Another group told us they're getting over 400 inquiries about how to get out of the military every single month since this war in Iran started. And essentially what these service members are telling me, one in particular that was deployed to Operation Epic Fury, is that they were being asked to target and bomb civilian infrastructure, which of course is a violation of international humanitarian law, according to the Geneva Accords. I also spoke with 2 service members who were deployed in support of Operation Southern Spear, which of course is those boat strikes you were talking about. We've seen about 60 of them over the last year. 210 people were killed. And they basically told me that they don't feel as though there was any intelligence or justification to prove that the people on those boats were in fact narco-terrorists. And they believe that in the process of those boat strikes, they perhaps were killing some innocent civilians. I want you to take a listen to what one of the leaders of the groups who's helping these applicants had to say about all of this.
We talked to people who, were true believers, who joined out of a deep sense of duty and of service, and have gone through this profound, deep moral exploration of what they are capable of doing and what they have seen over their lifetime, but also the past several years, and in particular, the actions with Southern Spear and Epic Fury have caused them to completely change in their beliefs and what they're able to be part of.
And by the way, Peter, a lot of them also cited that Manab school bombing where 150 schoolgirls and teachers were killed.
That was on the first day of the war in Iraq.
Exactly. And the United States has never claimed responsibility for that. But I think this surge in civilian deaths is also something that's incredibly concerning. Another thing I want to point out really quickly is that these service members aren't afraid of dying themselves. They're just not behind what's going on. And they don't feel like they can look themselves in the mirror when they're killing people and they don't believe in the cause.
If they're willing to give their lives, they want to be willing to do it for a cause that they can stand behind. General Clark, let me ask you about this. How unusual is this in your experience? Not just that these service members are objecting, but they're now actively looking to leave the military.
I'm sure we had these problems during Vietnam. I was a captain. I was a company commander. I had troops there who they were drafted. They did their job, but many Americans went to Canada. Others did everything they could to get out of being drafted, feigning medical injuries and things like this. And it was an unpopular war by the time 1968, 69 rolled around. It wasn't when it started, by the way. So whenever you have an unpopular war, and this war in Iraq, Iran does not have the support of the American people. It does have strong support in the Republican Party, but by and large, independents and Democrats don't seem to support it. And so naturally, you're going to have people who are disaffected in the ranks.
One of the criticisms, of course, is that President Trump, when this war began, didn't make the case to the American people about why it was necessary. I also want to ask you about what we're learning. The Army, I should note, is responding to the New York Times description of the service as rudderless, saying that their leaders exemplify excellence and are pushing the mission forward. But I want to talk to you about some of this reporting that we've been detailing here. When Hegseth took office, there were, I think the number is 10 four-star generals, now 5. That's the fewest in decades. How does the military maintain its effectiveness, General Clark, when it's losing leaders with this kind of institutional knowledge, especially at a time of war?
Well, at the lower levels, this is not visible. And so the commanders at battalion, brigade, maybe division level, just ride through this. They're concerned, they're watching it, they're hearing things, but they're going to do their duty. And this is the great strength of the American Armed Forces. And so when you see these headlines, yes, they're headlines, they're political. And you've got to put the burden where it belongs. This is a problem for the United States Congress and for the White House. The Congress approved Secretary Hegseth's extension, despite some concerns about it. President Trump is supporting him. And so, I have the full faith in the United States Armed Forces and the people who are in them. They're going to do the best job they can. They're going to try to soldier on despite this turbulence at the top. But you do have to acknowledge that this is a matter of concern, especially for let's say the flag officers, the 1 stars and the 2 stars out there who see this, and they're very careful about what they say. They're very careful about what they're doing. They know that there's some sort of culture war aspect of this that's making them uncomfortable. But they're going to do their duty, and they're going to do the best they can to carry out the orders of the commander-in-chief.
And I think ultimately, obviously, it speaks to the voices that are in the ear of Secretary Hegseth, who is clearly one of the voices in the ear of the president right now. General, the Washington Post also reports about the Kid Rock investigation. Folks may remember this. This was the flyby by a military helicopter outside his property as they were, looking over the pool there, the Statue of Liberty faux statue there as they celebrated this moment. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is defending the general who had, I guess, approved this, saying that he's the kind of leader that the Army needs. But is this normal for an Army's number 2 officer to tell the top officer to drop an investigation related to an ally of the president? That they dropped the investigation into this?
I think what's normal is that something like this would be investigated, because we've had instances like this before. We've had soldiers who would steal a tank and drive it to downtown Colorado Springs or try to get to Denver, things like this. And it always results in an investigation. You don't just say, hey, great job. And in this case, there's some political overtones to it that are very disturbing, because we want our armed forces to be politically neutral. We don't want them to be out there on one side or the other. And I think the armed forces have done a good job of that on balance ever since the Vietnam War. We've really tried to be politically neutral.
You just imagine if something like that continues to happen, right? You all of a sudden have sort of Army helicopters showing up at birthday parties for allies of the president. In fact, that's what they were doing there for Kid Rock. Let me ask you, if I can, Priya, about this again. The USS Abraham Lincoln, as you led the reporting on all of it right now, the conditions they've had, it's now on its way back home to San Diego. We should note you were based during your time with the Navy in San Diego, Coronado as well. First on MS Now, of the 2 destroyers that were deployed with the carrier, there were 3. 2 of them are now staying behind right now, right? What more do we know about this, and what's the potential impact? Family members are speaking out, saying, hey, we want our loved ones home too.
Absolutely, Peter. One of them actually told us that they find this disrespectful. Typically, a carrier strike group has an aircraft carrier and 3 destroyers. Like you said, each of those destroyers have about 300 sailors on board, and they're tasked with protecting the carrier during this deployment. And they face many of the same supply shortages that we saw on the carrier, food and hygienic products, not in large quantities. And they also have been facing a lot of morale issues, too. And we just discovered that the USS Spruance, which is based out of San Diego, and the USS Murphy, which is home ported in Hawaii, are not going home. Their deployment has been extended once again. We already know what that does to the morale of these sailors. And so their loved ones simply want them to also be part of their conversation. And they want people to discuss the fact that these 600 sailors have essentially been left behind in the Middle East. We, of course, reached out to the Department of Defense, who said that, this happens sometimes with carrier strike groups. They don't always stay together. But Navy leaders at the beginning of this month had said that they would all come home together.
Still historic record length deployments for so many of these sailors and Marines, not just sailors who are aboard a lot of those ships. General Clark, one last question to you, if I can. ProPublica is reporting about how top commanders told Pete Hegseth not to cut what is the civilian protection program. They effectively run around the room, and the folks said to him, yeah, we want to try to keep it as intact as you can, even if that requires some cuts. He got rid of it anyway. I bring that up because obviously we have seen the death toll among civilians rise as a function of this war, as we were speaking about earlier, that first day where that school was hit, more than 100 children killed there. Just your takeaway about this discarding a program that was designed to limit deaths among civilians.
Well, we know in the military that if you kill innocent civilians, it's not only wrong, but it also it discredits the armed forces, and it brings a lot of political pressure, and so it's wrong. It undercuts the mission itself. So that's why the commanders were speaking up for the need for this. We were very careful in my campaign in Kosovo. We tried to screen every target. We looked at possibility of collateral damage. We had experts who did it in the Joint Staff, and that has been beefed up in the 20-odd years since that time. So I would hope that we'll keep that program in place, and if it was reduced, we need to put it back in place. We have to protect innocent civilians as best we can when we're accomplishing the mission. It's part of the mission.
Here now to get into all of that, Vaughn Hilliard, MS Now senior White House reporter, is back with me. Michael McFaul is a former U.S. ambassador to Russia and MS Now international affairs analyst. Joel Payne, Democratic strategist and former senior aide to Hillary for America. And Jeff Mason, Bloomberg White House correspondent. Vaughn, I want to start with you. We have seen for years the president's aides, whether it's in the first term or the second term or during the campaign, say one thing and the president undercut them. What is the actual stance of this administration when it comes to where these negotiations are and who backed away from the table?
The talks are dead, and the president of the United States, his word ultimately is the one that should be taken, because we have seen not just once, but now 3 times that the United States has walked away from the negotiating table with Canada, trying to push blame on the Canadian partners. But it's not just Canada, it's South Korea, it's China, it's European allies. Over the last 18 months, President Trump and this White House have repeatedly walked away from the negotiating table after notably seeking and getting great concessions from trading partners. And South Korea is another one of those examples. They had committed last fall $300 billion, most of that in direct cash to the United States in order to lower their tariff rate from 25% to 15%. And then what did the president do here in the year of 2026? Well, he announced that they were going to cut in half the joint military exercises that the U.S. military forces do with South Korea. If you look at Canada, again, it was last fall that the president walked away from the negotiating table, citing the digital services tax that Canada had on the U.S. And ultimately, what did Canada do? They actually conceded, and they removed the digital services tax. But fast forward, the president of the United States continues to walk back on commitments that have been made. And we have seen repeatedly the number of concessions, and I think that really calls into question for the Canadian partners who have announced a strategic partnership with China just earlier this year. And then Mark Carney saying this week that they are going to more urgently work with European markets to access in place of the United States. I think what word the United States, ultimately how good it is over the next 2.5 years of this Trump presidency.
Ambassador McFaul, the idea that we are moving away from our allies and essentially, especially when it comes to Canada, forcing them to deal with China is one thing. But also listen to how that Ontario Premier Doug Ford spoke about President Trump and what he's forcing and how he's treating our allies. Listen to this.
He's treating us, like we're communist China here. We're the closest friends and allies that the U.S. has anywhere in the entire world.
So much of the president's messages about this administration are about the golden era of America or going back to some former glory. When you hear what the premier says, when you've been watching this all play out, does it feel like America is in a golden age, especially when it comes to our relationships with our allies?
Well, absolutely not. It's not a golden age. There's no evidence to support that hypothesis. But I disagree with the premier. I think he's wrong. We treat communist China, Xi Jinping. President Trump treats communist leader Xi Jinping much better than he treats our Canadian allies, much better than he treats our South Korean allies, much better than he treats our European democratic allies. And that's the paradox, the tragic paradox of this moment, that President Trump seems to like to get along better with communist dictators, autocratic dictators, than he does with our democratic allies. He bullies our allies and he appeases the autocrats. And in the short run, in the beginning of the administration, and I've talked to several governments about this, they had a strategy, let's just deal with the crazy uncle. Let's appease him. Let's capitulate. We have more important things to do than fight over this stuff. But President Trump just keeps doubling down. He has over-personalized his foreign policy. It's all about him. It's whims. It's not about America's national interests. It's hard to have a rational conversation with him about these things. The Canadian trade deal is part of that. The South Korean, we're stopping training exercises with our South Korean allies just because he's mad at them about their position on Iran. And so that over-personalization and that bully mentality, people are finally tired of it. They're just saying enough is enough, and they're just waiting him out. I think they're just waiting him out, hoping that we'll have a different kind of president.
Jeff, the idea that folks are waiting the president out, or they kind of understand who they're dealing with, right? In the first administration, people were unsure, right? Like Canada, I don't think would have been talking the big talk that they're talking at this moment. When you look at how this White House engages with our allies, more importantly, how our allies are starting to engage with the United States, it feels very different than it has in the past.
Well, it feels a little different, at least from the beginning of this second term. Yeah. At the very beginning of this term, you saw institutions within the United States and foreign governments outside of the United States, obviously, in more of a mode of appeasement. And Mike is certainly right about that. This has changed a little bit with Canada, although it's worth noting that Prime Minister Carney, when he came into office, also came with a friendly message to President Trump. They had a meeting in the Oval Office. He was pretty upbeat, and the president walked away from that meeting also with much less negative rhetoric against Canada. He stopped calling Canada the 51st state. Right. He was not a fan of Justin Trudeau, and once Trudeau was out, it looked like maybe there would be a reset, at least in terms of the president's view of that relationship. Mm-hmm. But that has changed now because Canada is not accepting the changes and accepting the aggressive tariff structure that President Trump is putting into place.
Yeah. And Joel, this is all obviously not happening in a vacuum. It's happening just 69 days away from the midterms. I want you to hear Josh Turek, the Iowa Senate nominee, about how he's talking about how this is going to hit his state. Listen to this.
This is just one gut punch after another. We're a state that has, I think, been disproportionately hurt, arguably the most of any state by the tariffs and by the war in Iran. I mean, we're basically dead last for every single economic metric.
Blueberries, potatoes, lobsters, lumber, they cross back and forth across the border. Everything is impacted by these tariffs.
That's also Representative Chellie Pingree. Joel, when you are thinking about how Democrats should be using all of the chaos that is swirling around the Trump administration, swirling around our economy, and therefore swirling around the American people, is this the right message that they should be sending and leaning on?
Well, I think it's the reality. So the reality makes it the right message. I mean, the reality here is that Donald Trump's wars are killing the American economy, whether or not it is the hot war in Iran, whether or not it's this trade war that is the subject of this conversation we're having, whether it's his culture war that is going after experts and people who can help make sure that we ride out the economic storm that we're in right now. His wars are killing the economy, and I think Democrats have an opportunity to lift up that message and to give that the type of prominence with voters that it should have. I mean, Eugene, you talked about Josh Turek there from Iowa. We saw someone from the Northeast, Maine. Susan Collins is on the defensive about this. Michigan is a state that relies a lot on trade with Canada, even in the Dakotas. I mean, you're seeing the type of economic backlash in places that are safe states for Republicans. And I think that that's happening is because the American people are seeing that Donald Trump's agenda is harming them. It's making their life materially worse. And these are not things that are happening to him. These are things that he is making affirmative decisions to have happen. And I think that's what's also unique about this as well. These are not exogenous events that he, just kind of came to him, acts of God. These are things that he himself have chosen to engage in, and it's having negative consequences on all Americans.
Jeff, there's been reporting that Susie Wiles, the chief of staff of the White House, has said, let the president be the president and the rest of us are going to focus on the affordability message. That was weeks ago. Does that seem like it's still working out for them?
Well, let's circle back in November. On that. I mean, it's interesting that the president has been resistant to the affordability message for months. I mean, he's called it a
hoax.
Thank you for that. That's the word I was looking for. He's called it a hoax on behalf of Democrats. But the irony, of course, of that is that he won election in 2024 largely on an affordability message. He promised to come in and bring down inflation and bring down prices. And the fact that he's initiated the war with Iran and these tariffs, number one, make it his economy now. So voters have a reason to blame him. And number two, provide a contrast to the message that he made as a candidate.
Yeah, that message is confusing. But, back to you, Ambassador McFaul, his message foreign policy wise is also confusing. What we've seen in the past, as Jeff noted, was a lot of a capitulation at the beginning of this administration. You talked about how folks feel like they have his number. What does a country right now, currently, and as we end 2026 here, have to gain by saying yes to the United States, by being our ally?
That's a great question. I don't think there's a lot of incentive for, especially in democracies, for leaders to say yes. Obviously, the Prime Minister in Canada, Carney, has learned that. He's at over 60% right now in his popularity. And there's this notion that you want to try, you want to get along, you deal with bullies when you have to, and then at a certain point you just get tired of it. And when you get tired of it and pivot away, that makes you popular in your own countries. Even some of the president's closest leaders a year and a half ago, think of Prime Minister Meloni in Italy, has just become fed up with him. And that makes her popular in Italy. So I think it makes it very difficult. I would say this generally, bully ball, coercive diplomacy generally does not work well with allies over time. But I think you're seeing an exhaustion with it and people are pivoting away. And the other thing I would say is about the American people. He didn't run on any of this. Remember that. He didn't say, vote for me and we're going to invade Iran. Vote for me, we're going to annex Greenland. Vote for me, we're going to get in a big fight with Canada and South Korea. And I think I've been giving book talks around the country, been into 50 different talks in 15 different states. People are fed up with this. This is not what they voted for. And I think on the foreign policy side, this is going to play negatively for the Republicans as well.